The day I graduated college, my parents, who dumped me in foster care at 12 to travel with my sister, showed up smiling in designer clothes. I laughed, not out of joy, but because I finally saw them for what they were: opportunists. They hadn't called me in over a decade, not for my birthdays, not when I won a state debate championship, not even when I got accepted into college with a full scholarship, but there they were, smiling like proud parents, like we were still a family. I didn't hug them, didn't thank them, I didn't even speak. I turned away, diploma in hand, and walked straight into the arms of the people who raised me, right? My foster parent. You see, my parents left me because I was inconvenient. Emma, my sister, was the star. I was the extra, disposable. So they couldn't afford me, yet somehow they afforded luxury cruises, private schools for Emma, and a blog filled with lies about their minimalist journey. Now they're broke, homeless, reaching out like I'm their savior, but I'm not a lifeboat. In the storm, they thought they escaped. I used to think my family was unbreakable. Back then, I would have done anything for them, especially for my parents. Greg and Laura weren't perfect, but in my eyes, they were everything. I believed we were a team, one of those families you saw in commercials where things might be chaotic, but love always pulled everyone back together. That's how it felt to me. Like no matter how tough things got, we'd always choose each other. I was the kid who made excuses for their silence, who defended their absences with, "They're just busy" or "They're tired." I thought loyalty meant protecting them even when they didn't protect me. I remember nights when Emma, my older sister, had school projects or recitals and all attention turned to her. I'd sit quietly in the back, clapping like crazy, cheering her name louder than anyone else. If they forgot to pick me up from practice because they were caught up with Emma's schedule, I'd laugh it off. "It's okay," I'd say, even if I stood alone in the cold for an hour. I didn't just accept being second place. I normalized it. I made it noble in my mind. That's what good sons do, right? They don't complain. They stay steady. They keep the peace. When Dad lost his job for a while, I stopped asking for birthday presents and told him I didn't really want to party anyway. When Mom started snapping more often, I tiptoed around the house just to avoid stressing her out. I thought maybe if I could be easier to love, they'd love me more. I cleaned. I helped Emma study. I made dinner when they worked late. I became the background glue of the family, silent, unnoticed, but always there, holding everything together. One winter, Emma got pneumonia and had to be hospitalized for a week. My parents practically lived at the hospital. No one asked how I was getting to school or if I had eaten. So I made my own lunch, set my own alarm, and kept the house clean so they'd have one less thing to worry about. When they came home exhausted, I brought them tea and said nothing about the fact that no one had checked my homework all week. They told me I was mature for my age. I beamed like that was a badge of honor. There was this one time I overheard my mom say to a friend on the phone, "Adam's easy, he doesn't need much." I remember standing in the hallway, frozen. I thought that was a good thing, that I'd earned her approval by not being a burden. I wore that sentence like armor for years. Looking back now, I realize I was invisible, but back then, I thought I was being loved in a quiet way, the grown-up way, the selfless way. So when they sat me down that day, when they looked me in the eye and said they just couldn't afford to take care of me anymore, I didn't get angry right away. I didn't scream or fight. I searched their faces for a sign that they were joking, or at the very least, breaking inside as much as I was. They weren't. The people I had bent over backward for, the ones I had worshipped quietly, chosen daily, and sacrificed for, were choosing to let me go. And not just let me go, but replace me. Because they didn't leave as a broken family. They left as a trio: Emma, Greg, and Laura, off to live their dream life without the one person who never asked for much in the first place. At first, I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being sensitive, but the signs were there, quiet, constant reminders that in my family, I was optional. It started with space. Emma's art took over the house, framed, spotlighted, and praised by every visitor. My science project that won second place, it sat in a corner for weeks until it was eventually thrown out. We didn't have room, Mom said, like my effort wasn't worth a shelf. At dinner, conversations always circled around Emma, her classes, her art teacher's praise, her upcoming competitions. If I spoke, I was politely ignored or redirected. That's nice, Adam. So anyway, on family trips, Emma got the window seat, the best snacks, the playlists tailored to her taste. I didn't complain. I figured that's just how families worked. Someone shines, someone supports. I convinced myself I was proud of her, that her success somehow included me. But it got worse. One day, I overheard Mom on the phone saying, "It's hard enough supporting Emma's talent. We can't afford distractions." I didn't know what that meant until I realized she was talking about me. I wasn't troubled or rebellious. I just existed, quietly, in the background. The straw that started to break me was the music class field trip. I'd begged them for weeks. It wasn't expensive, just a small fee to join my class at a local concert hall. I even offered to use my saved-up allowance to cover most of it. Dad shrugged and said, "We're tight this month, maybe next year." That same weekend, Emma got a brand new set of professional paintbrushes and a private lesson from a local artist. When I asked why she got that, and I didn't even get the field trip, Mom sighed. "Adam, don't be difficult. This is about Emma's future. Music is just a hobby." His words stuck like splinters. My dreams were hobbies. My needs were distractions. My voice, unwelcome noise. Eventually, I stopped asking. I stopped showing them my grades. I stopped mentioning the books I liked or the stories I wrote. I stopped trying to prove that I was worth seeing. I thought maybe if I made myself even smaller, they'd appreciate the silence, that they'd finally look at me and say, "Wow, Adam's so responsible. We're lucky to have him." But the smaller I got, the easier I was to forget. One day, I came home with a scraped knee after walking 2 miles in the rain because no one picked me up. Mom barely looked up from her laptop. "There's a towel by the door," she said. Emma walked in behind me, complaining that her art class had been boring. Within seconds, both parents were at her side, asking questions, offering snacks, comforting her. It was like I was invisible. I remember sitting in my room that night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd done something wrong. Maybe I hadn't tried hard enough. Maybe I was too quiet, too easy, too nothing. I thought about telling someone, a teacher, a counselor, but how do you explain being overlooked? There were no bruises, no yelling, just a slow erasure, and deep down, I still believed they loved me, that this was just a phase, that eventually they'd notice I was still here. But deep down, something else was forming, a quiet ache I couldn't name yet, a feeling that maybe, just maybe, if I disappeared completely, nothing would change. I didn't know it then, but I was being prepared, conditioned even, so that when the day finally came, when they told me they were leaving me behind, it wouldn't feel like a betrayal. It would feel expected. The day everything shattered started like any other. I was 12, sitting on the floor in my room, organizing my action figures in what I called battle formation. Outside, the sun was slipping through the blinds, casting stripes across the carpet. It felt safe, familiar. Until my mom called out in that strange voice, the one she used when she was pretending everything was fine. "Adam, come downstairs, we need to talk." My stomach twisted. I thought maybe I'd forgotten to take the trash out or broken something I didn't realize, but when I got to the living room, both my parents were sitting on the couch, stiff, serious, like they were about to deliver a corporate announcement, not talk to their son. Dad gestured to the armchair across from them. Sit down. I blinked. The air felt too still. I sat, clutching a pillow to my chest like a shield. Mom cleared her throat. Adam, this isn't easy for us, but we've hit a rough patch financially. I didn't say anything. I waited for the part where they told me we were moving to a smaller house or cutting back on cable, something manageable. But instead, Dad leaned forward, hands clasped tightly. We can't afford to take care of you right now. At first, I thought I misheard him, like maybe he'd meant something else. Take care of what? Was I a bill they couldn't pay? You're gonna stay with another family for a while, Mom added quickly, just until things get better. Her voice was soft, rehearsed, like she'd been practicing it in the mirror. I looked between them, trying to find the joke, the prank, anything that made this not real. But why me, I asked. Why not Emma? Dad frowned. Emma's in high school. She needs stability right now. I felt like I'd been slapped, and I don't. Mom reached out, but I pulled back. My hands were shaking. You're not being abandoned, she insisted. It's just temporary. That word, temporary, like I was being loaned out, returned as if they'd pause being my parents for a while and then pick it back up when it was more convenient. I ran to my room, slammed the door, sat on the floor, and tried to breathe. My heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. I could hear them talking downstairs, calm, composed, like they'd already moved on. The next day, they packed a duffel bag with some clothes and my toothbrush. No toys, no keepsakes, just essentials, like I was being sent to a sleepaway camp I never signed up for. The ride to the foster home was silent. I watched the trees blur past, each mile pulling me further from the only life I'd ever known. I thought about jumping out of the car, running away, making them come find me, prove they still cared. But I just sat there, frozen. When we pulled into the driveway of a neat little house with a white porch and flower boxes, I knew this was it. There were two adults waiting outside, Mr. and Mrs. Miller. They smiled, kind and warm. Strangers. My parents got out first. Greg popped the trunk like he was delivering a package. Laura walked over to me, crouched beside the car door. We love you, Adam, she whispered. We'll see you soon. She kissed my forehead. It felt cold. Final. Dad didn't even hug me. He shook my hand. I'll never forget that moment. His palm in mine, dry, formal, like I was a client, not his son. Then they left. I stood on the porch, duffel bag in hand, watching the car disappear. They didn't look back. They didn't even hesitate. That night, I couldn't sleep. The bed was soft, the room clean, but nothing felt right. I kept expecting a knock at the door, a phone call, something, but it never came. The days turned into weeks, then months. No letters, no visits, no we miss you, just silence. One afternoon, while the Millers were out grocery shopping and I was home alone, I made the mistake of Googling my parents, and their social media profiles popped up instantly. Bright, curated, filled with smiling photos on beaches, at brunches, laughing under fairy lights. They hadn't fallen on hard times. They were thriving. They'd started a travel blog called The Freedom Family. Their tagline? Letting go of what weighs you down to chase what truly matters. Wasn't mentioned, not once. But Emma, she was in every photo. Center stage, smiling, glowing, celebrated. They hadn't just left me, they'd deleted me. I scrolled in silence, my throat tight. Each post was a knife. One blog entry was titled, Minimalism, Releasing What No Longer Serves You. They meant me, they didn't even hide it. That night, I punched the pillow until my knuckles burned. Then I cried until I couldn't anymore. Not soft tears, raw, shaking sobs. The kind that twists your stomach and makes you gasp for air. They chose her, they abandoned me, and now they were telling the world it had set them free. That was the moment I stopped believing in family. I wish I could say I moved on quickly, that I let go, brushed off the pain, and started over. But that would be a lie. After discovering the truth that my parents didn't lose everything, they just didn't want me, I unraveled. Quietly, slowly, but completely. The Millers tried their best. They gave me space, encouraged me to talk. Mrs. Miller started packing little snacks in my backpack with notes like, "Hang in there," and "You matter." Mr. Miller would knock gently on my door each evening, asking if I wanted to play chess or just hang out. I usually said no. I didn't want kindness, I wanted answers. I kept asking myself, why me? What was so wrong with me that my own parents could drop me off like unwanted furniture and never look back? In school, I stopped speaking unless I had to. My teachers noticed, but I didn't care. I wasn't angry at them. I just didn't have the energy to pretend anymore. The hardest part wasn't the silence, it was pretending to be okay when I wasn't. I started having dreams, vivid ones. In them, I was back home. My mom was making pancakes. My dad was laughing at something on TV. Emma and I were playing cards. I'd wake up smiling. Then I'd open my eyes, see the unfamiliar ceiling, and remember, they chose to live without me. One afternoon, I came home to find a small, wrapped box on my bed. Inside was a secondhand camera, the kind I'd always wanted. Mrs. Miller had left a note beside it. "Maybe you can start capturing what matters." I stared at it for a long time, then I shoved it under the bed. What mattered? I didn't even know who I was anymore. At night, I'd scroll through my parents' blog like a masochist. I memorized the dates of their trips, the captions of their photos, and even the clothes they wore. It was like studying a different species. They smiled so big in every shot, as if nothing had been lost. Once I commented anonymously on one of their posts, just a single sentence, "You forgot someone." They deleted it within the hour. That should have made me feel powerful. Instead, I felt erased all over again. And yet, despite everything, some part of me still hoped. I kept telling myself, maybe they'll reach out, maybe they'll say it was a mistake, maybe there's still room for me. That hope was toxic. It poisoned everything. I couldn't fully hate them because I kept clinging to the fantasy of them changing. The worst moment came during family visitation day at school. Parents lined the hallways, arms full of flowers and homemade posters. Kids ran into hugs. Teachers beamed. I stood in the corner with my hands in my pockets. The Millers came, of course, they always did, but when Mr. Miller reached out to ruffle my hair, I stepped back without thinking. He looked hurt. "I'm sorry," I whispered. "It's okay," he said gently. "We'll stand right here as long as you need." They didn't force a hug. They didn't make a scene. They just stood beside me, quiet, solid, like anchors I didn't know I needed. That night, I pulled the camera out from under the bed. I turned it over in my hands, then aimed it out the window and snapped a picture of the empty street glowing under a street lamp. It wasn't a masterpiece, but it was something. As a beginning. Healing didn't come all at once. It wasn't like flipping a switch. It was like watching a slow sunrise after a stormy night. Unpredictable, subtle, and often missed unless you really paid attention. In the early days after the breakdown, I couldn't sleep through the night. Even with the Millers' kindness, I flinched at sudden sounds and carried an invisible weight on my shoulders. I'd wake up sweating from nightmares of being left on that porch again, cold and unwanted. But I never told anyone. I just got up, splashed water on my face, and tried to breathe. Mrs. Miller noticed. She always noticed. One morning, she placed a camera on my breakfast plate instead of pancakes. "It's old," she said, "but it still captures beauty, just like you." I didn't say much, but I took it. And that camera became my shield, my voice, my therapy. I started snapping photos of everything. Sunlight on the porch, squirrels in the yard, shadows across the floor. Somehow, the camera helped me frame the chaos in my head. It made the world feel more manageable, and it gave me something that felt like mine. Then came the photography club. At first, I lurked in the back, saying nothing, but one day they asked us to bring a photo that made us feel something. I brought a picture of the Miller's hands, weathered, wrinkled, resting beside cups of tea. It was love, captured. And when someone in the group whispered, "That feels like home," I realized I'd found a piece of mine again. As the months passed, I grew braver. I joined the debate club and then the yearbook team. I even ran for student council, not because I wanted to be popular, but because I was tired of being silent. The world had taken enough from me. I wanted to take something back. I got a part-time job at a bookstore. The smell of pages and the quiet hum of readers gave me peace. Every paycheck, I put a little away, saving for my future. Mr. Miller taught me how to budget, how to understand credit, and how to think long-term. Being broke once doesn't mean you stay broke, he told me. You learn, you grow, you move on. Every small success felt monumental. The first time I helped a customer, the first time someone said, "Hey, Adam, you're good at this." I wrote it all down in a journal, proof that I was becoming someone new. And then came Ryan. We met through the photography club, but we bonded over video games. He never asked about my past, never pitied me. He just accepted me, and that was everything. Our friendship wasn't dramatic, it was real. The kind of real that steadied me on bad days and celebrated me on good ones. One evening, he invited me to a small party. I almost said no, but then I remembered how far I'd come, so I went. And for the first time in years, I laughed without guilt. I danced terribly. I sang off key, but I felt free. Emma reached out again. She sent a message late one night. "I know I didn't protect you back then. I want to make it right." I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to scream. Another part, the tired, healing part, just wanted peace. So we talked, slowly, cautiously. She told me our parents had built her up to break me down, that she felt guilty for not seeing it sooner. We weren't close, but we were trying, and that counted. Then came the letter, full ride scholarship. I stared at it in disbelief, me, the unwanted child, the liability, now the one with a future. The Millers cried, Ryan cheered. I posted a simple update online, nothing flashy, just gratitude. And that's when Laura commented, "We're so proud of you, Adam. Let's reconnect soon." It didn't break me, it didn't even sting. It made me realize I'd won. Not in a petty way, but in a profound, soul-deep way. I'd rebuilt what they broke. I'd survived what should have ended me, and I'd done it without them. So I deleted the comment, blocked her again, and then I went outside, looked up at the stars, and smiled for real. Because healing is when their approval no longer means a damn thing. Because peace isn't when they apologize. Peace is when you stop needing them too. After that moment, things began to shift faster. I wasn't just surviving, I was growing. Mrs. Miller noticed how much I loved helping other kids in the photography club and suggested I try tutoring. I hesitated. What could I possibly teach someone else? But she looked at me and said, "You've survived more than most people ever will. That alone makes you strong enough to teach." So I started tutoring at the local community center, just a couple hours a week at first. The first time I saw a kid's eyes light up because of something I explained, I knew I'd found something bigger than a job. I was building a connection. By junior year, I was juggling school, a job, clubs, and volunteering. It was exhausting, but it was also exhilarating. I wasn't running anymore, I was chasing. Ryan became more than a friend. He was my rock, the first person I called when I aced a test or when I broke down from stress. He never tried to fix me, just stayed by my side. That meant more than words ever could. One night, we sat on the roof of the Miller's house, watching planes blink across the sky. He asked me, "What would you say to the kid you were at 12? I swallowed hard, then said, I'd tell him he made it, that it wasn't his fault. and that love, real love, isn't supposed to hurt. The words surprised me, but they felt true. That was healing. Not forgetting, not forgiving the unforgivable, but living despite it. Eventually, I started speaking at foster youth events, telling my story not for pity, but to remind others they weren't alone. I watched kids lean forward when I spoke. I saw tears, laughter, and hope. And I knew I was doing something that mattered. When the scholarship award was announced publicly, a local newspaper did a feature on me. The headline read, "From Foster Care to Full Ride, Adam's Journey." My picture was on the front page. The Millers framed it. I cried when I saw it. Everything I had once feared would define me, being abandoned, being unwanted, had become the fuel that built me. I wasn't anyone's liability. I was my own legacy. College gave me more than just a degree. It gave me distance from my past, from Greg and Laura, from the wounds they left behind. But it also gave me clarity. I wasn't just going to move on. I was going to rise so high that even the shadows of what they did to me couldn't reach. After I graduated, I didn't immediately go into a traditional job. Instead, I expanded on the financial literacy workshops I'd started in college. With the Millers' help, I filed to make it an official nonprofit. I called it Restart, a name that felt like both a promise and a declaration. Our mission was simple: teach financial empowerment to young people from disadvantaged backgrounds. We created content, hosted events, and started partnering with high schools and foster organizations across the country. Within a year, we were on national news, not because I was trying to be famous, but because the story of a former foster kid teaching others how to reclaim control resonated. I got invited to speak at panels, on podcasts, and even at conferences. One of them flew me first class to New York. It was surreal. As I looked down from that plane window, I thought, 12-year-old me never saw this coming. And I smiled, not out of pride, but out of gratitude. And then came the documentary. A producer who had heard about Restart reached out. She wanted to feature me in a series on resilience. At first, I hesitated, putting my trauma on film, letting the world see the pain, the abandonment, the rawness of what happened. It felt too vulnerable. But I thought about all the kids still in the system, the ones who needed to know it was possible to survive and thrive. I said yes. Filming was emotional. They interviewed me, the Millers, Emma, and even Ryan. I held nothing back, but I didn't name Greg and Laura. They didn't deserve the spotlight. I only referred to them as my biological parents, because that's all they were now, biology, nothing more. The day the documentary premiered, it went viral. People messaged me from all over the world. Some were survivors. Some were teachers. Some were parents who said they'd never understood what foster kids go through until now. One message stood out. It was from a kid in Florida. "I watched your story in a group home." He wrote, "I thought I was broken. Now I want to be like you." I cried because that's what my revenge looked like. Not screaming matches, not lawsuits, impacts. Greg and Laura, of course, saw the documentary, and like clockwork, they tried to spin it. They posted online, pretending to be proud, trying to paint themselves as misunderstood. "We always believed Adam was special," Laura wrote in a YouTube interview I did. "We're glad he's doing well." But this time, they weren't met with silence. They were met with receipts. Emma had saved emails, messages, and old blog posts they'd written during their tropical escape. Posts that contradicted every word of their current sob story. People dug up the travel blog. People asked questions. And suddenly, their facade crumbled. It was poetic justice. They'd spent years trying to curate a perfect image, but the truth had a way of finding the light. Their comments were flooded with people calling them out. Eventually, they disabled replies altogether. Meanwhile, I bought my first home, a 2-story fixer-upper in a peaceful neighborhood. I invited the Millers and Emma over for a small housewarming. Over lasagna and lemonade, Mrs. Miller looked around and said, "You built this, Adam, with integrity, with heart." That was the greatest compliment I'd ever received. Then an email came. It was from my former high school. They wanted to rename their new financial aid program after me. The Adam Initiative, they called it. A full circle moment. The same school where I once lied about why I didn't have parents, now honoring me as a beacon of perseverance. One evening, I got invited to speak at a gala for donors of a major youth foundation. I wore a tailored suit, stepped onto the stage, and shared my story with a calm, powerful voice. I ended my speech with this line: "You don't have to be born into a legacy, you can build one from the ground up." The room erupted in applause, and in the crowd I saw Ryan, Emma, and the Millers smiling through proud tears. That was my revenge. Not yelling at Greg and Laura, not answering their calls, but becoming undeniable. The next day, I got tagged in a tweet that made me laugh out loud. Someone had screen capped Laura's old blog post about letting go of material weight, and next to it, a picture of me receiving a humanitarian award. The caption read, "Imagine throwing away gold because you thought it was too heavy." That was it. It was the full circle. I wasn't chasing closure anymore. I was the closure. Greg and Laura didn't deserve a confrontation. They didn't deserve my words. My silence was louder than any fight. And every time I looked around my life at Restart, at the kids we were helping, at the family I'd built from scratch, I knew I didn't get even. I got better. And that was the classiest revenge of all. But just when I thought things had calmed down, another opportunity knocked, one I couldn't have predicted. A publishing house contacted me after seeing the documentary. They wanted to offer me a book deal. At first, I was hesitant. What else could I possibly say that I hadn't already shared? But they insisted. "Your story could change lives," they said. "It's not just about survival, it's about transformation." I spent the next year writing the book. It wasn't just a memoir, it was a blueprint for kids like me, for anyone who's ever been discarded. I titled it "Not Yours to Keep," because that's what I had to tell myself over and over. Their neglect, their rejection, it wasn't mine to carry forever. The book launch was small but intimate. Friends, supporters, and even a few kids from Restart showed up. When I finished my reading, a teenage girl approached me, tears in her eyes. "They told me I wouldn't amount to anything," she whispered. "But after reading your story, I want to start over. I want to try." That was it. That was the moment I realized my story wasn't just mine anymore. It belonged to anyone who needed it. And then came the offer that truly shocked me. A university wanted to give me an honorary doctorate for my work in education, youth development, and advocacy. I, a former foster kid with no family, no money, no home, was now Dr. Adam. I accepted the degree not for the title, but for what it symbolized. Proof that where you start doesn't define where you end. The ceremony was televised. Greg and Laura saw it. How do I know? Because they emailed me afterward. Again. This time it was a single line. "We were wrong. We're sorry." I didn't reply. Not because I was bitter, but because there was nothing left to say. I had already written my response. In every workshop I taught, every youth I mentored, every piece of hope I passed on, let them sit in the silence. Let them live with the echo of what they gave up. I had risen with grace, with dignity, and with fire, and there was no higher revenge than that. After the honorary doctorate, things seemed to fall into place like puzzle pieces finally landing where they belonged. My nonprofit expanded, branching into multiple states. I was invited to consult on educational reforms and foster care policies. Every day, I woke up with a sense of purpose. But I always knew that Greg and Laura, somewhere out there, were watching it all. They weren't done. A few months later, Emma called me again. Her voice was calm, but I could tell something was off. "They're trying to sue me now," she said, almost laughing at the absurdity. claiming I slandered them with that viral post. My stomach turned. Are you serious? Dead serious, she said. But don't worry, I lawyered up, and you're mentioned in their complaint too. They're saying we ruined their lives. I sighed. It was always the same game with them. Blame, deflect, manipulate. They had turned their downfall into a vendetta, one last desperate attempt to claw back some control. But what they didn't realize was that we were no longer the kids they could intimidate. Our lawyer filed a counterclaim, defamation, harassment, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. We compiled everything, emails, social media messages, and even voicemails they left on Emma's phone. The evidence was undeniable. When the court date arrived, I sat beside Emma in a modest suit, surrounded by the quiet dignity of people who knew the truth. Greg and Laura entered the courtroom looking nothing like the polished, tropical blogging couple they once pretended to be. Greg's face was sallow, Laura's expression hollow. They looked worn down by their own bitterness. As the judge read through the accusations and counterclaims, Greg shifted in his seat. Laura avoided my eyes. The court didn't take long to rule. Their claims were dismissed, our counterclaim was acknowledged, and they were ordered to cease all contact and pay damages for the legal costs. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to make a statement. Outside the courtroom, Laura tried to speak. Adam, wait, can't we just... No, I said firmly. There is no we, not anymore. Greg opened his mouth, then closed it. For once, he had no comeback. We walked away without looking back. News of the case spread online, especially among the audience that had followed the documentary. The sympathy Greg and Laura once fished for evaporated overnight. Even the few supporters they had left abandoned them. Their names became cautionary tales in online forums about toxic parenting and emotional abuse. Months later, a journalist reached out. He'd been digging into Greg and Laura's past, into their financial scams, unpaid debts, and shady business ventures. Turns out, the fraud accusations weren't isolated. They had scammed small investors, misrepresented projects, and even falsified income on loan applications. The story made headlines, and just like that, whatever remnants of their reputation remained were gone. They were blacklisted from business communities, dropped by their remaining friends, and publicly discredited. No more sympathy, no more second chances. But the real twist came when I got a letter, not an email, a real handwritten letter from Greg. It was short, almost clinical. We've lost everything. We're sorry. We need help. There was no warmth, no reflection, just desperation. I reply, Emma asked if I wanted to frame it as a reminder. I said no. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even hurt. I was indifferent. And that, I realized, was the ultimate punishment. Not screaming, not revenge, just living well and letting them watch. Years passed. They eventually dropped off the map. Rumors said they were living in a cheap trailer park on the outskirts of Nevada, barely scraping by. Nobody visited, nobody cared. Meanwhile, Emma and I visited the Millers every holiday. Restart opened its 10th chapter. I got engaged to someone who knew the whole story and loved me, not in spite of it, but because of it. And every once in a while, when someone brought up forgiveness, I simply smiled and said, I already forgave them. I just didn't invite them back into my life. Because some doors, once closed, should stay that way. What surprised me most was not how quickly they fell, but how few people tried to catch them. Greg and Laura had spent so many years burning bridges that by the time they needed help, there was no one left to call. They had alienated friends, colleagues, and even distant relatives. Their false charm had run dry. Even their old blog, once filled with curated posts about freedom and letting go of negativity, was now flooded with angry comments from people they'd wronged. One post had nearly 100 replies from former business partners, unpaid freelancers, and acquaintances who'd loaned them money and never heard back. It was like the mask had finally fallen, and everyone saw the truth. Emma and I received messages from some of those people. A woman named Carla wrote, I lent them $2,000, 0 cents when they said their son was in the hospital. Now I know the truth. Thank you for speaking out. Another man messaged, they conned me into investing in their eco-travel brand. I never got a dime back. Stories were painful to read, but also strangely validating. It wasn't just us. We hadn't imagined it. Greg and Laura hadn't just been bad parents. They'd been bad people. A year after the court case, I was invited to speak at a national conference on youth empowerment. The venue was massive, the stage intimidating, but I stood tall, and in the middle of my speech, I said something I hadn't planned. My parents once saw me as a liability, something to cut from the budget, but what they failed to see was that I wasn't the end of their story. I was the beginning of mine. The applause was thunderous. Afterward, a young man approached me backstage. He looked nervous, maybe 19 or 20. I'm in foster care right now, he said quietly. Your story? It made me believe I can do more. I put a hand on his shoulder. You can, and you will. You're not what happened to you. You're what you choose to become. It was moments like that that reminded me why I'd shared my story in the first place. Not for revenge, but for reclamation, to take back what was mine, my voice, my worth, my future. And somewhere out there, Greg and Laura were probably still hoping for a miracle, but the only miracle was that Emma and I had survived them and built something beautiful from the wreckage they left behind. That was their real punishment, knowing we didn't just move on, we rose. I used to think my story began the day my parents left me on that porch, a 12-year-old boy clutching a duffel bag full of hand-me-downs and unanswered questions. For a long time, I saw that as the moment everything fell apart. But now, looking back as a grown man, educated, stable, fulfilled, I realized that moment wasn't the end of something. It was the beginning. My life didn't collapse when they left. It cracked open. In the years that followed, I learned what real love looks like. It wasn't Laura kissing my forehead before vanishing. It was Mrs. Miller folding my laundry while humming quietly to herself. It wasn't Greg shaking my hand like a business deal. It was Mr. Miller sitting with me in silence after a bad day, handing me a root beer without asking questions. Real love didn't need to be loud or showy, it just needed to show up and stay. The Millers weren't perfect, but they gave me space to grow, to fall apart and piece myself back together, to build an identity that wasn't shaped by guilt or abandonment, but by choice and resilience. And Emma, she became more than my sister. She became my mirror, my reminder that we didn't come for nothing, we came from survival. And we chose to be better. Forgiveness, that word gets thrown around a lot. People treat it like a cure-all, like the moment you say, I forgive you, the pain just evaporates. But that's not how it works. Forgiveness, for me, meant releasing the weight I didn't ask to carry. It meant saying, I won't let what you did define who I become. It didn't mean reconciliation. It didn't mean opening the door again. It meant peace. When I teach now, whether it's a group of foster kids, a college seminar, or a nonprofit board, I always share a version of this story. I don't tell it for shock value. I tell it because someone in the room always needs to hear it. Someone who thinks their broken past means they can't have a beautiful future. And I tell them the same thing I tell myself every morning. You are not what they did. You are what you do next. There was a time when I was terrified of becoming like Greg and Laura, selfish, detached, always running. But now I see them for what they were, people who chose comfort over courage, lies over growth. Don't fear turning into them anymore, because I've already built a life that proves I won't. I have my own home now, not just walls and furniture, but warmth. A bookshelf overflowing, a fridge with magnets holding up my niece's drawings, a guest room that's always ready for Emma when she needs a break from her city apartment, a porch where I sit with friends, with laughter and barbecue smoke in the air. And someday, maybe I'll have kids of my own. If I do, I won't promise to be perfect, but I promise to stay, to show up, to listen. Because that's what real family does. Greg and Laura, I don't know where they are anymore. Occasionally, Emma still gets updates through distant relatives. Last I heard, they were trying to start another blog, something about starting over in the desert. I wish them well, truly, but from a distance. The story I tell today isn't about them. It's about who I became because they left, and who I chose to be despite that. Every scar they gave me turned into something useful. The anger fueled my ambition. The silence taught me how to listen. The abandonment showed me how to stay. And maybe most importantly, the betrayal gave me the blueprint for honesty. So if you're reading this or hearing it at one of my talks, wondering if you'll ever be whole again after someone breaks you, you will. Not overnight, not easily, but slowly, fully. You'll build something better, maybe even beautiful. Because at the end of the day, your story isn't defined by who walked away. It's defined by who stepped up, and that includes you. Let that be your legacy, not the pain you inherited, but the love you chose to create.